All right, so this video is to talk about why the United States got involved. We are going to briefly, we're going to go ahead and move on here and just talk about North Korea. So on June 25th, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, and we'll get into why that happened during class. But this video is to talk about why the U.S. decided to intervene. So, on June 25th, 1950, North Korea rolls into South Korea. Now, why did the United States then decide to intervene? The two nations basically came about because the Soviet Union rolled through China at the end of World War II, just before the Americans dropped the bomb, and they rolled all the way into North Korea. Now, they stopped at the 38th parallel because that's where the U.S. troops were massing and training for the invasion of Japan. And basically what happens in that situation is then Korea is divided into two. And the idea was that each nation would kind of run those, and then when they left, they would hold or unify them through elections, but the Soviets weren't budging. So the United States held elections, and a guy by the name of Syngman Rhee took control of South Korea, and Kim Il-sung took over North Korea, and so and created a communist government there. And both sides wanted to unite. And so finally, North Korea was able to convince the Soviets, and we'll talk more about that later. And so they invade South Korea on June 25th, 1950. Why'd the U.S. intervene? Reason number one, Dean Acheson was the Secretary of State. And basically, he laid out what was going to be the U.S. perimeter of defense, where the U.S. would station troops, where the U.S. would consider this their area to protect. And you can see the line right here. This is basically what he describes in his speech. And you can also notice that Japan is basically the highlight here. And so you see right here Japan, and then it comes back this way. And so the Philippines, Japan, this seems to be where the United States is going to hold its line. Notice that South Korea is not part of that. And so this speech kind of signals to North Korea, and signals to the Soviets that Dean Acheson, or that the United States was not going to defend South Korea. Now, that was never part of this message. It was never part of what they had decided. What they had decided was that they would station troops within those areas, that the U.S. would then defend those with their own troops. They never intended for this speech to be a reason or to say, we're not going to defend South Korea. So that was not the intended U.S. message. All Dean Acheson done, or what he said he did later, was just to repeat MacArthur's position that the exclusion of South Korea was not what the U.S. not try to stop an invasion, but that they would not station troops. They pulled out of South Korea because they were worried Syngman Rhee would try to invade the North. Or do something that would get them involved in a war, and they did not want to get into a land war in Asia, number one rule in history. So, however, this oversight emboldened Kim Il-sung and his backers to go ahead with the invasion, and it's one of the reasons people give for why Stalin finally approved Kim Il-sung's desire to do that. So we talked about reason number two is ideology or containment. As you can see here, this is the North Korean troops invading South Korea, and these are Soviet tanks. And so basically the Soviets had equipped the North Koreans to be able to invade. So containment ideology also played a serious role in Truman's decision to defend the South Korea. Just as was the case with West Berlin, America could not lead non-communist world by caving into a demonstration of strength by the opposition. They didn't see this as North Korea trying to unite with South Korea. They saw this as a Soviet-planned invasion. And they could not lead, so they felt like that, and the rest of the world is going to see this as a modus of the Soviets. So indeed, allowing South Korea to fall to risk was a even riskier proposition than giving in the Soviets to Berlin. The communist attack was ostensibly a sole initiative of the North Korean leader. We now know that this is not true, but it was the way they were dealing with it. And for the U.S. to stand idly by while the weakest communist powers conquered a small, otherwise defenseless country was not an acceptable position for an administration that had defined its main global doctrine by its resolve to risk communist expansion on a global scale. Basically, this would show a major defeat for the idea of containment, and this would lower American prestige. And so the ideology or the policy of containment was the reason for going in and helping in South Korea. Why did the U.S. intervene? Again, reason number 3, McCarthyism. Afraid to look weak and be criticized by the Republican Party. Basically, McCarthy Truman intimidated President Eisenhower later, and basically he was, with his anti-communist message, felt like he could then put forward what he felt like was important. Basically, Truman had been taking McCarthy's accusations because of the loss of China. Now, the loss of China is a bit of a misnomer because the Democrats get hammered for it. But basically what had happened was that Chiang Kai-shek and his government was crumbling. They were corrupt. They were crumbling, and they had treated the Chinese people roughly. And so the communists, who had basically not fought the Japanese as hard, had basically done what they could to enamor themselves with the countryside of China, basically gain the people's trust, and were able to basically overthrow Chiang Kai-shek, who then moves to Formosa, which is now what we call the island of Taiwan. And so you have McCarthy, who continually intimidates Truman and others by basically stating the fact that you gave up China. And the United States, or China, was going to become a communist country, and it wasn't the U.S. that chose to do it. They just chose to stop giving money to a corrupt government. But for somehow this became kind of Truman's fault. And it also coupled that with the Soviet dropping of the bomb. It gave McCarthy a lot to criticize, and therefore could be considered maybe one of the reasons that the U.S. had to go into Korea. But it also can be seen as one of the things that was an advantage of going into Korea, is it silenced McCarthy and the critics. So, reason number 4, and this is something we're going to look at a little bit more today. Or actually, we're going to look at reason number 4, don't have that one up here, is the NSC 68, which is a document that talks about the fanatical faith that the Soviet leaders have and their desire for total domination of Eurasian landmass. With this polarized world, the U.S. needs to build a more powerful bomb, build up conventional forces to defend our shores, and enable it to fight limited war abroad. I think one of the things, we are going to read this document today, for the first day of class, just to kind of look at what was going on with NSC 68 and what is its role within Korea. The last reason I want to talk about is reason number 5, and this is what John Lewis Gaddis, who wrote a book on the Cold War, is considered one of the major historians. This was his reason. He felt like this was the major reason for why they got involved, and that is Truman didn't want to let the UN down. And we could say that it wasn't that the UN had already decided to go in and the U.S. were going to support them, but the idea of collective security. So to allow the Soviets to allow North Korea to invade South Korea goes against the whole idea of collective security with the United Nations, which follows in the wake of the failure of the League of Nations. And so to allow this to happen would basically weaken the UN to the point where it was no longer really a body that would be worthwhile. Now, so Truman went as far as the UN, as this type of action would allow collective security, to basically wither away. And to not defend the UN's base of collective security would be allowing history to repeat itself, and to appease aggressors only to make them more bold, and to appease them by stepping out and allowing this to happen would basically end the United Nations and their ability to basically fight this type of aggression. So this is one of the major reasons why Truman went in, and basically to defend the UN and their right to use collective security. And the UN winds up actually coming to the aid of the United States, and many of the UN nations wind up participating in Korea. And this is because they follow, on June 26, 1950, Truman ordered the United States planes and naval vessels against North Korean forces. And because there were troops already stationed in Japan, they were able to move the first troops over very quickly. On August 29, 1950, the UN troops with the British Commonwealth 27th Brigade arrived, and so the UN began to participate as well. And the only reason the UN was able to participate was that Stalin had made a mistake. Stalin was on the UN Security Council, and basically, if he would have been there, one vote on the Security Council can end any type of UN action. So if the Soviets had been there, they would have just voted against this, and that would have kept the UN out of it. But because they were boycotting the UN, that allowed the UN to go through it. And they were boycotting because they felt like Mao should be added to the Security Council and to the UN. And until that was going to happen, the Soviets wouldn't come back to the United Nations. And obviously that probably might have led to why the Soviets allowed the North Koreans to get involved in the first place, and underestimated the UN and underestimated the United States' desire to support that. So this is probably the reasons why the United States got involved. The last thing to talk about was the fear for Japan, and Japan's safety would be jeopardizing by facing a communist Korea. To allow the entire landmass to fall under to fall under North Korea and basically be a satellite of the Soviet Union would leave the United States, that Japan would be difficult to defend because of how close that is. By giving South Korea, or continuing to defend South Korea, the United States is keeping a buffer for what they consider much more important, which is Japan. So that is why the United States got involved, and we will talk more about first why the Koreans got involved, and then what it looked like after the United States got involved, and how they fought the war.